Hello, my name is Brendan Decora, and I want to welcome you to my podcast, Pro Audio Profiles. Here, I'm going to interview recording engineers, mixers, producers, and others in the pro audio field. Together, we're going to learn how you can make amazing records that can give your listeners goosebumps. Welcome to the show. On today's show, I'm pleased to invite Michael Frondelli. He has credits with Billy Idol, Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, Pat Benatar, and Oingo Boingo. He has a long history of not only engineering and producing records, but also finding and developing new talent, launching the Neo Swing movement with Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, starting in New York at Electric Lady, and also spending a considerable time as Vice President of Capitol Studios. I'm pleased to have him on the show.
First of all, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
You're welcome. I'm happy to have you.
I'm happy to be on the maiden voyage of your podcast.
We've known each other a long time, and it's good to have you. Absolutely.
I'm honored to be here.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. So I wanted to ask you obviously you've done engineering, you've done producing, sometimes you do both at the same time. Mm-hmm. What methods and workflows do you do to help create magic for the artist to happen? As an engineer versus as a producer, how does that vary for you?
I try to stay out of the way. Really, it's the truth.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's all in the preparation. It's all in choosing the material. It's all in preparing the artist. If it's a contained band, it's more important to spend the time with them beforehand to pick the material, to rehearse them in a setting where they feel comfortable. Mm-hmm. And if you have the opportunity, if they're doing gigs, local gigs or something like that, that you can actually get them to play the stuff live. Because if you're going to capture it in the studio, you want it to sound as natural as possible, right, and give them the opportunity to make mistakes, see how it works in front of a live audience, mm-hmm, see what doesn't work,
of course,
what needs to be improved, and that way we can do it before we get in the studio. So you can economize on the studio time.
Of course.
Especially in new bands, you don't have a big budget.
Right. And that being said, obviously it varies for each artist, but do you typically go for capture everything as much as you can live in the studio, or go the overdub route and just try to get drums and then do a bunch of overdub sessions?
It depends on the level of performance that these musicians have. If you've got really good musicians, you like to get as much as you possibly can. If I can get a basic track with a rock band, if I can get bass and drums minimally, mm-hmm, that would be fantastic. You want to capture that live simply because that's the heart and soul of it all. Even a live vocal, and I always record a vocal live because that's the roadmap. That's the roadmap for the dynamics. In the past, experience is what you get when you don't get what you want. So if you're in the studio and you're laboring over trying to get a vocal track over a basic track that you didn't originally record a vocal on, you learn.
Right.
And
also, a lot of times I've found when you record, for me, it's really important to make sure the quote-unquote scratch vocal is recorded the best you can, because often that's when you get the best performances, when people don't think that that's the final take. They're having more fun with it.
Well, again, I joked about it in the beginning, but staying out of the way is key. It's an artist comes in the studio, and that's when they're most vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And if they're going to expose the soft white underbelly of what they're doing, all the insecurities and the critics come out. You want to try to avoid that at all costs and give them the opportunity to exceed their own expectations and let them think they did it themselves.
Right. What are some of the things you look at? Obviously we've all worked in different studios. Some of them are amazing A-list studios. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you don't have a good budget and you have to work in a smaller studio. What are some things you look out for when you're working in a smaller B-list studio or whatever?
Good question. I have to do my research. I have to go find out exactly what's there. In my mind, I have to already prepare myself for what I'm going to need. If they have a good mic collection, Hopefully they have good mic collection and some good mic pre's.
Mm-hmm.
That's all you want. You just want a clean input. Even if you don't have, my preference is always to record on a Neve console.
Right.
In the past, it's always been to record on a transformer balanced console and mix on a transformerless console. So for a long time, I was mixing, I was recording on Neve 8068s, 8078s, 8028s, 8038s, 48s,
Mm-hmm.
and then hopefully Class A, and then mixing on an SSL, which was a fun console to mix on. And you get a lot more crack out of the drums and
Right.
a lot more transient response. But if a studio is iffy, as long as I can get a clean input and a flat mic, I'm happy with that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been in some major studios that have a lot of problems because people today don't necessarily keep up the consoles the way they used to, because people are so used to having clean mic preamps, but to play it back through the console and break out the channels, usually you're going through Pro Tools Mixer, and then you're using a 2 output, and that's it.
Right. And a lot of tracks are mixed completely in the box now anyway, so.
Yeah, I do it. I do it here.
Yeah.
It's more important that your client can send you messages and updates and ideas and things you want to try.
Mm-hmm.
I do as best I can to conceptualize who wants what and how they want it to sound, what they imagine they can sound like. You can only do so much with people's tracks that you don't record,
Right.
and you don't have input with. But it's I do my best to try again to please them and give them what I feel would be something that meets their expectations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You've been around in the industry for a long time. You worked at Electric Lady and Capitol and, a lot of different places.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the things that you learned in let's say, the Electric Lady days?
Well, Electric Lady was just, I was there 75 to 84, so it was rock and roll. It was rock and roll and jazz fusion. The first record I ever was a second engineer on was Chick Corea's Leprechaun.
Nice.
And it was full on. It was full on. I mean, it was just, you had to bring your A game, and it was really new. But my music background really helped. And I fortunately, working with analog machines, I've got fairly decent time. So punching in, especially at that time, there was in Studio B, there was an MM1000. And in Studio A, we had an MCI 24 track. It was one of the first ones. So you really had to know your head gaps. You really had to know your punch-in, latency, how to anticipate. You also had to know where you were. With Chick, everything was written out.
Right.
Steve Gadd came in. He had a chart that was at least 6 pages long. And he was reading it live, especially for things like Night Sprite, which was super, super fast tempo. And, 3 takes, it was done.
Nice.
And I worked at that time with the engineer was Bernie Kirsch, who wound up working for Chick for many, many years later.
Okay.
So, yeah, there was that. There was also how to stay awake for many days at a time.
Many days?
Yeah, many days at a time.
Jeez.
You were working with certain producers and engineers or as an engineer. Mm-hmm. And all they want to do is give you chemical aerobics to keep you awake so you can keep working. That's tough. That's tough to really stay sharp and be clear. Also, communication with a lot of rock artists. I mean, at the time, we did a lot of rock and roll at Electric Lady. It was Kiss, it was the Stones, it was Zeppelin, bands like April Wine, Brownsville Station. It was coming hot and heavy. you never knew who was going to be in. But every artist was different. Every artist's temperament was different. There was all of that personality management that you had to deal with, or personality if you were a second engineer dealing with an eccentric producer or an engineer.
Right.
You got to learn. You got to learn who you are and what's required. It's really hard to be a great second engineer.
Yeah.
It's really, really hard. Especially when the lion's share of the responsibility, even in the analog days, was really on you. Now you're into data management and file management and, routing, whether it's now with Dolby Atmos using Dante and all kinds of stuff. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to keep track of. You can make templates and set it up, but there's a lot to keep track of. It's a big responsibility. Yeah. And now you get engineers who really don't understand how to deal with a lot of analog gear. Yeah. And that's a whole nother situation because, it's a plugin. Oh, yeah, no, it's a little different. Mm-hmm. That Fairchild 660 plugin is not the same as a Fairchild 660. Right. It's close. It's got its merits, but, it doesn't sound like. So it's really about, a lot of times the second engineer is educating the engineer and giving them some insight and letting them allow them to feel that they've learned something new without embarrassing them. And
even the clients, too. Like, so many artists now record themselves and know enough about engineering that, there's been many times I've been in the studio and the client comes in and looks at the outboard rack and they're like, wow, I've never actually seen one of those in real life. I always use the plug-in, So that happens a lot too.
IRL, baby.
Yeah.
In real life.
Exactly.
It's what it is, and it's all we ever knew how to do. Mm-hmm. I'm from the days of when we had to, as I'm sure you are, do recall for consoles and all the
taking pictures of the console, literally
making sure that if you took pictures of the console and the EQ, that you had the right angle to take the shot. Yep. So you didn't get parallax on the view and not know where the EQ was, and somehow or another do recalls. Mm-hmm. Now in the box, it's, thank God, in its own way. It's got what's fun for me a lot of times here is to record. It always sounded better to me to record in analog. Mm-hmm. If you record in analog and then you transfer to digital, it's another sound. If you're able to then record in digital, do your overdubs, and if you got a great console and you got all these great stereo pairs that you've worked on for a while, and you break them out, it's almost like a big remastering session. Yeah. And you can use some of the analog gear to sweeten it and do things like that really make a difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you create depth in the image. You can create a lot of stuff like that.
Nice.
So, there's more than one way to get to the airport. You just got to figure out what your best route is,
Of course. So you worked at Capitol as well. Can you tell me about those times?
Yeah. After I recorded and, mixed most of Rebel Yell for Billy Idol, I came out to Los Angeles, and I got an opportunity to come out here to work at Giorgio Moroder's studio because the producer Keith Forsey was directly connected with Giorgio, and I was out here on another gig working at the original Larrabee in West Hollywood, and they asked me if I was interested in working, and I said, yeah. They said, have you worked in film? I said, yeah, somewhat, soundtracks for film back in New York. I worked with Dave Grusin and Larry Rosen and Al Pacino movies and stuff like that. But he said, you're going to record score. You ever do that? And I said, not really. That's all you're going to learn. Sit down. So I wound up recording a score for the movie The Breakfast Club, working with the director John Hughes and this fabulous film editor named Dee Dee Allen, who cut Dog Day Afternoon, Bonnie and Clyde, The Hustler, Reds. Really talented lady. So to make a long story short, this snowballed for me, and I started meeting. There was such a brain trust of songwriters and musicians that worked at that studio. One of whom is Richie Zito, who I saw today as I was going to the gym. As I was leaving the gym, he was coming out.
Nice.
And Richie brought me to Capitol.
Okay.
I think the first, I'm trying to remember the first artist. It was either Animotion or it was Berlin with Terry Nunn. I can't remember now who was first. So working in Studio B with a 32 input Neve 8068. And I love 8068s, and the crew at Capitol the maintenance techs were just amazing. There were things there that you couldn't find anywhere else. And most of the gear worked. I mean,
right.
And
it's Capitol, so you'd hope so.
Well, Capitol at that time wasn't exactly, first on people's list because it was an institutional studio.
Oh, okay.
A lot of Capitol artists didn't want to work there because they didn't want to be under the watchful eye of A&R and the executives.
Oh, I see.
They didn't want people dropping in. But you had people like Bob Seger who worked there all the time. He loved working there with Punch Andrews and great engineer David Cole. But at the time, David Cole was on staff at Capitol when I first came out here, and you could either get him to first for you or he would second for you because it was union.
Right.
And, it was kind of weird, to have David Cole seconding for me. I mean, he was such a great engineer.
Yeah.
So, and Pete Dell and Charlie Picari then, now Christina Picari. So it was, and great engineers, tech support. John Sands was the chief, and then later Jeff Minnick. Great crew, and everybody was so eager to please, and I had fun with everybody. So what happened was that I had done so many projects there. I did, I mixed 2 Oingo Boingo records there. I did Dead Man's Party and Boingo with Danny Elfman in Studio C in an old Neve 8108. And it was hard work to get that thing to sound great, but I had enough outboard gear.
Right.
With Pultecs and some Neve 31105s. There was enough gear that I could put in the chain in order to be able to bypass a lot of that.
Right.
And I never liked the Uri 813s that were in the room, so I would use near field, Yamaha NS10s or Oratones, or bring my ROR special cubes. They were really cool. So that went on for a number of years, and I was doing that between, I guess, 85 to 88, somewhere around that, 3-4 years. So I moved back to New York, and we've been commuting back and forth. I kept a place out here and a place in Brooklyn. And I would commute. I had to remember what clothes I left where.
That's a long commute.
I had a locker in New York for gear, and I had a locker in LA for gear. And so it was 1990, and it was in the spring of 1990, and I got a call from the guy who ran HR for Capitol, and he said, would you be interested in interviewing for a position as the head of the studios? And I said, okay, why not? And they flew me out, and apparently I was recommended by the staff.
Okay.
My predecessor had moved on, and they were interested in someone who can bring the studio back to what it once was, because Capitol in its heyday was one of the first recording studios on the West Coast.
Wow.
Dedicated to music.
Right.
It was started by Glenn Wallachs, who had Wallachs Music City, which is a real evolutionary kind of a record store that had sold music instruments and had listening booths for records. And there's a great YouTube video called Wanna Buy a Record with Mel Blanc, the guy who did Bugs Bunny, and Billy May, a great arranger that worked with both Nat King Cole and Frank Sinatra. And it gives you some insight into the original Capitol Studios.
Nice.
So I got this call. I came out and I interviewed. And then I met with Joe Smith, who was this iconic record executive who, together with Mo Austin and Lenny Waronker, built. They were the triumvirate at Warner Brothers, who signed the Dead and the Doobie Brothers and all these great acts. Yeah. So Joe said to me, "We want to bring Capitol Studios back to the great era that that it once was, that the great studio that it once was, where you had to wait to get studio time in there." So I interviewed, we made a deal. I came out December 1st, 1990, and began as the director of Capitol Studios. So I didn't know a lot about corporate. It was a whole new world.
Right.
Aside from having, experience as an engineer, I had a business degree.
Mm-hmm.
So they put me together with a Harvard MBA for management training. And I learned how to deal in the corporate world. The politics was another story, but Joe Smith was great. Joe mentored me and gave me opportunities. I could still produce and engineer records.
That's cool.
Yeah, he says, as long as you don't blindside me about anything.
Right.
And then we had a union. We had the IBEW.
And what were some of the things you guys did to, bring it back to its prime?
There was a lot to do.
Yeah.
There was a lot to do. We had this fabulous studio manager who was hired in August ahead of me. She came from Sound City, Paula Salvatore. Mm-hmm. And Paula, street savvy studio manager, came from Johnston, Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. And, we were the two Italians in the office there. And we had some challenges in front of us. We had a staff that had been seriously challenged by my predecessor. The studios weren't really part of the record label. Mm-hmm. They were a separate profit center from Capitol Records.
Okay.
They reported directly to EMI UK, or EMI North America, and as a separate profit center. At the time, it was about a $5 million a year business. Not only did I have the studios, the 2 live studios, a mix room, I had 6 production suites and 2 mastering rooms, with Wally Troggett being the senior mastering engineer and Ron McMaster, who worked there up until recently. And the 6 editing suites were all post-production suites for the labels.
Okay.
And what they would do is they would make cassette masters for the plant. They would do what we call 9-pin transfers using 3/4-inch pneumatic, and they would do stuff for special markets, Blue Note, Angel Records. So there was a serious amount of business. I also had the EMI archives in North America. I had 250,000 original masters. I had multiple medias. I had everything from video, art flats, transcription discs, analog tapes. So there was a lot on my plate that I had to watch. The archive was a tremendous responsibility because a lot of my work was in there from all the stuff that I had done for EMI.
Right.
But at the same time, there were a lot of people's works in there that
of course
needed attention. So we were also very focused on preservation and restoration and anti-piracy, all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So what did we do? Studio A had just gotten a Neve VR with a film module in it. It wasn't the Todd AO film module, but they had a film module in there, so they could do, I guess, 5.1 at the time. And, anything up to 6 stripe. But it wasn't being booked. The studio utilization was really, really down. And we had to figure out how to do that, how to market the studio. The studio was also being used by the label for parties.
Okay.
And they weren't paying for it. They felt that they were entitled to have the studios and they could do whatever they wanted. And my predecessor had no boundaries, and he was not an engineer, so he didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And I had high standards. My focus was that I didn't want anybody to work in a studio that I wouldn't be happy in. We had some great engineers that would come in. And at that time, Al Schmidt was just starting to come in occasionally. You know, I had met Al Schmidt in Hawaii a few years before, but I didn't really know him well. But it wasn't really consistently being used. And there were engineers who would come in and do projects, but not enough in order to keep it going. So Paula and I had to work at it. Paula had really smart marketing sense, and she would make cold calls on the phone and say, I got openings. You know, what are you doing? We had to figure out who our competition was. I did the first ever business plan for the studios. At the time, there were about 250 competing studios in Los Angeles.
Wow.
And then we started this whole thing with the home studios. There was an organization that was protesting against the home studios, that people were using them and they were booking them like commercial studios and not having to pay what the studios were, and you know, insurance and taxes and ADA compliance and all kinds of stuff, which I couldn't be a part of simply because Capitol Records would promote a lot of these artists to, well, not promote, but encourage these artists to build their own rooms because their budgets were really ridiculously high.
Okay.
I mean, they had done it. I had mixed a record for Eric Johnson called the Via Musicom, and Eric was notorious for being a perfectionist, and rightly so. But you know, it was better for him to have his own room, his own studio. So if you want to help an artist like that, you help him invest in his own room, and then he can do it to his heart's content as long as he can control costs. Right. So we did extraordinary things. We did things like live radio shows. We did. We shot videos. We did movies. We were doing movies with Warren Beatty and Annette Bening, booking the rooms out as a set.
Oh, wow.
Paula was notorious for doing that. I mean, she could book anything. Word got around that everything worked. So my main focus was maintenance. And how can we stay on top of this? At the time, digital multi-track tape recorders were a big deal. You know, 3324s, 48s, Studers, Mitsubishis. I never bought any. I would never invest in them. I just made really good deals with rental companies and made it a pass-through to the clients who were willing to pay. Right. And it made it a lot easier for us because our techs didn't have to maintain it. If something happened, we get a new machine.
Plus, those machines were exorbitantly expensive, too.
It was ridiculous. Yeah. And I didn't have budgets for that.
Right.
So how do you do it and remain competitive? Plus, you know, what was really tough is salaries, because union wages were a lot higher. We had to pay minimums. Right. And the employees were getting 4% a year in increases. Right. I also had another problem because I had only so many second engineers, and my setup positions were not union. So I had to make provisions within the contract that I can have certain people go in and out of classification. Oh, wow. So I can train people and build an apprenticeship program. And that was the whole idea, because the best way to learn this, I mean, all these schools are great, and you get great on the box. You know, you learn how to, you learn digital audio, and but when it comes down to getting it clean off the floor and knowing how to mix and
that's the one thing. Like school, like they'll teach you how the gear operates. They won't teach you how to get things to sound good.
Right. It's
to
a
do
lot.
sessions or any of that,
I always say it's not what you know, it's what you do with what you know.
Exactly.
And do you know how to apply it? And it's really difficult if you haven't seen it done properly.
Right.
If you've not been around someone who's made hit records and show you how the communities of practice work together, what the skill sets that are required, So what happened was that I realized the assets and the deficiencies of a lot of the guys and the women who worked there, because we had Leslie Ann Jones, who was an engineer there, and Capital was pretty open-minded about having women there, and as engineers. So the idea would be that we also had a lot of engineers who've been there forever in production.
Right.
Bob Norberg, Jay Randalucci. We had some guys who've been there since the 50s and 60s.
Wow.
So that's priceless knowledge, and maintenance techs too.
Yeah.
Alberto Coronel, who just passed about in the last 2 years, he would set up the Neumann lathes for cutting lacquers so we can ship them off to the plant in Jacksonville. And he was also our analog 2-track maintenance tech and could rebuild machines. And he was also our microphone tech to keep the Neumann collection that we had. Fabulous mic collection.
Right.
And that was in disarray. Everything was in disarray. It wasn't really cared for properly. It wasn't really thought out well. It was all, put together with, Scotch tape and rubber bands. And
Right.
And I saw all this and I said, let's just break it down. Let's start it all over again, because this is not going to work. It's not sustainable.
Right.
And it's too dangerous because we're risking the reputation of a major company.
Yeah.
A lot of exposure with Capital. It also gave me a lot of privilege too.
Yeah.
I was a little crazy at times and threatened console manufacturers whose capacitors were crapping out on the consoles, and I need them replaced. And they said, "No, you have to pay." And I said, "No, because you'll be on the 6 o'clock news."
Jeez.
So, I begged forgiveness, not permission, from people at the time. And I got wise enough to be able to see how I can build budgets every year that worked for the business.
Right.
And at the same time set up the apprenticeship that was required and how to do that. So eventually what happened was that it started to attract, it made a home for Al Schmidt.
Of course. Yeah.
And the reason was that everything worked. Al was extremely demanding and, and rightly so. Al would come in 3-4 hours before a date and make sure everything, he kicked the tires and checked the throttle and make sure his plane was all ready to fly.
Right.
And he was a great example for all of us that way. I had been engineering a long time, and then I saw how Al worked, and it's like, oh my God. It's so simple yet so
exactly.
so complex at the same time. But you also see how he can manage a 70-piece orchestra between the two rooms.
Right.
And everybody from the setup guys, we were doing short turnarounds on big dates, and it was hustle. And you got to make sure you got all your lines are clean. You don't have any cross lines with headphones and microphones, and you have to know everything is to track it down.
Right.
And what we learned was that mistakes happen, but how do you learn from them, and what do you do? Well, my philosophy was, you don't look for the blame, you look for the solution, and you try to go through what I used to call a post-mortem. and just go through and break it down and say, well, where did it fall through the cracks? Paul and I would sit down and with the team and say, how do we do it better? So, again, it was the philosophy that if you're good, people will seek you out.
Right.
If you do extraordinary things that people don't attempt to do, you can do them. And I knew that our tech support staff was that good that we could take on things that maybe only scoring stages would.
Right.
Post-production houses would, for TV and film.
Yeah.
To be smart about it, and how do you evolve, and how do you do it under the shadow of a union, and how you do it under the shadow of corporate. But the major thing was Frank Sinatra. That
Of course.
And I also knew how to play the game. I mean, when you got a big artist like that coming in.
Yeah.
And that's the time we started with EDNet.
Okay.
The entertainment digital network that came out of LucasArts. And George Lucas was using it to do dialogue capture from remote places with actors who were no longer available in L.A.
Right.
Or in, or at least in San Francisco area, San Rafael. So we did it to set up Phil Ramone, and so he can record artists in duets with Frank all over the world. And I got 6 channels of it. We only needed 2.
Yeah.
But I said, let's get 6. And we wound up using them all.
Yeah. Nice.
I mean, I was booking $600 an hour out of a closet.
Right.
Just to do DAT transfers for Clive Davis with a read after write DAT.
Right.
Because he had people mixing everywhere for him, and he's a hands-on guy.
Yeah.
And he's at the Beverly Hills Hotel. You give him what he wants,
Yeah.
I had David Foster doing it, too. I had Mick Gazowski mixing in New York for David Foster, and he's in a room with speakers he's familiar with and producing a mix from way before FaceTime or audio movers or any of that stuff. This was 1992, 93.
Nice. So then, after Capitol, I know you've done a lot of production and engineering and stuff since then. What are some of the highlights from that?
Well, after Capitol, I reconnected. I did a movie in 1986 called Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, a Chuck Berry documentary, and I was hired by Keith Richards. And the woman who produced the film was Stephanie Bennett.
Okay.
Who worked together with the film director Taylor Hackford, famous then for Ray. So Stephanie said, it was a couple of years after I left Capitol. I had to take a time out for personal reasons. And she said, you want to do this? I said, well, what is it? She said, well, we're doing the Graham Parsons tribute at the Universal Amphitheater.
Okay.
It's Keith, it's Nora Jones, Dwight Yoakam, Steve Earle, Raul Malo, all-star band, including James Burton and some of the guys who play with Manassas with Stephen Stills, and really, and the guys who play with Dwight Yoakam, Dusty Wakeman, Dave Raven, I think Doug Pettibone was on that too. Really great band, and rehearsed it all, went and recorded them with the Design Effects truck we did at Universal Amphitheater. Okay. And I got really good at doing a lot of this stuff because I was really finicky about being able to have things relock, regenerate code, making sure we had house sync, making sure that, the line cuts would be able to be used for the film. Then you had quality audio for them to listen to while they were making decisions. So we did that. I did that together with Dusty Wakeman, and then we did a lot of it at Mad Dog Studios. And then she said, "Well, don't get too comfortable because that was a 9-camera shoot." And we did that with, trying to remember who we did it with. It might have been Eagle Vision. I can't remember now. She says, don't get comfortable. We're going to do Earth, Wind, and Fire in Chicago live at the Greek.
Okay.
And at the time, this wasn't where you had a MADI connection out of a Digico console where you can go directly to Pro Tools. This is in 2000, would have been, I guess, 2005.
Okay.
So I had 2 trucks.
Nice.
I had Design Effects and I had Le Mobile with Guy Charbonneau.
Mm-hmm.
I had done work with Guy with Joe Jackson's Big World album. And Design Effects with Gary Ladinsky and Scott Peets and great crew. And so there we are, lined up on the center lane out at the Greek. 120 channels of audio off stage.
Damn.
I had a crew of 8 guys, and I ran between 2 trucks. And I was, I was more producing that because it was just too difficult to do all of it all at once.
Of course.
And I had to have mirrored systems. I had to, a backup system.
Yeah.
Because, Pro Tools at that point was not exactly as reliable as it is now.
Right. I mean, even now it's not that reliable.
But you had to have mirrored systems just to be able to split it off. And then I had to, reshape code. I had to feed 14 cameras.
Jeez.
Jim Gable was the video director, and he was amazing. And the DVD went crazy,
Nice.
So I didn't get to mix it, but I got to record it all. And
nice.
When you work in that kind of environment, you just gotta. My years at Capitol was my experience there was really helpful to be able to manage a crew of 8 engineers because you're communicating with people off the stage. You're making sure that and the mic pre's in many cases sat on the stage. With Le Mobile was different, but we split it up. I had the Earth, Wind, and Fire on the 8068 in Guy Charbonneau's truck in Le Mobile, and I had Chicago set up on the API in Design Effects.
Right.
And what was happening is that the guys were, Chicago was playing on Earth, Wind, and Fire's tracks, and Earth, Wind, and Fire is playing on Chicago's tracks. So, you had to make sure everything was in record all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
And and I had been there previously when it was being done. There was a show they were doing it, and somebody had a fly pack under the stage, and didn't have a mirrored backup system, and it was.
Oh, geez.
It's scary, and I couldn't risk it.
Yeah.
Not what, you got a 14 camera shoot. That's a big budget.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I wound up doing, I'm going to say we did a 13 show series out of Philadelphia at the World Cafe for Mark Cuban with Evan Heyman. I would go in on a Friday to Philly. And over the weekend, we would record 4 shows, 2 different artists, 4 different artists.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So we do Friday and Saturday night and record 4. And then we had a setup where the video edits were being done in Denver, and they would upload me a file, or maybe not upload at that point. I think I was getting a drive. And I was getting a QuickTime DV file, and I would have to conform to picture and mix all the audio and conform to picture, and then heal the segues if they had B-roll, whatever they were doing, interviews. And then I did a Farm Aid. We did That's Where We Met, I believe. It was Farm Aid 2007.
Yeah.
Where was that? That was at
At Glenwood.
Glenwood Place.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was also a very tricky one. A lot of cooks in that one, especially when you're working with some major artists, especially, in a Farm Aid situation with Neil, Willie, and
yeah, so many different.
John Mellencamp and whatnot. Allman Brothers were in that. It was interesting.
Yeah.
Dave Matthews.
It was a lot of work.
Yeah, Greg Allman and Dave Matthews.
That's right. I just want to take a quick break and tell you about my free guide detailing my techniques for recording huge snare sounds. Check it out now at brandondecora.com/huge snare. And now back to the show. And then, so we gotta talk a little bit about Big Bad Voodoo Daddy.
Yeah. Well, that was the whole thing. Big Bad Voodoo Daddy was a fluke because I was getting very frustrated under one of the presidents of the company. I'm being very diplomatic right now.
Okay.
And what was happening was that I had gone to this president and said that, listen, there is some downtime in the studio and it's not easily managed to be able to offer it to A&R. I said, but I can do it here. I said, if I have, I can work it if I want, break some, record some acts. Mm-hmm. And he and I, he disagreed with that.
Yeah.
So I told you my philosophy was beg forgiveness, not permission. And my partner, brilliant guy, Brad Benedict, who created the Ultra Lounge series for Capitol, he said to me, listen, I have this band called the Blue Hawaiians. He said they're really an exotic surf crime spy sounding band. Really, this is at the time of Quentin Tarantino and all these movies where he's using all this kind of music. And,
absolutely.
And the Blue Hawaiians were playing the Lava Lounge down in La Brea. It's like tiki bar, like tiny tiki bar. But you go there on a Sunday night, and it's like hush puppies and Hawaiian shirts and hot rods, And they were surfers. They were all surfers. One of the guys, the guitar player in the band, Mark, or Charlie Wilson as we call him, he was a lifeguard. He was a rescue lifeguard.
Okay.
On a boat, extreme stuff. But they were playing really obscure tunes. They were doing Marty Robbins songs. They were doing Lee Hazelwood tunes, John Barry 7, everything from Beat Girl to Hot Rods to Honolulu, Tom Waits songs, really. And the singer, Mark Fontana, he was reminiscent of Roy Orbison.
Okay.
So we wound up doing this record called Savage Night. We brought him in the studio, and we did this one song called A Cheat, which is a Lee Hazelwood song. Mm-hmm. And it was just blowing our minds. This was so cool. So where do you go with this? I mean, these guys were a little older, and they weren't young kids, and it wasn't so easy. But then Brad had this idea of recording finding these new bands and putting out New Sounds for Now, which was this disc. He found these artists all over the place and was going to do this compilation disc.
Okay.
And we were going to record some acts, and some he already had that they record on his own, like a guy named Ray Gelato, English cat that played, he was doing That's Amore and did a really kick-ass version of it. Eight and a Half Souvenirs, another band.
Right.
And we used to go to all these shows out of the Derby. And we were raiding the Derby, and I was bringing them into Capitol. And one of the bands that Brad said that he wanted to work with was this band called Big Bad Voodoo Daddy. They had already been in Swingers. The soundtrack was out. The movie was out. The movie was already in cable.
Okay.
And but Brad said they pack in on I think it was on a Wednesday or Thursday night. There's lines around the corner.
Oh, wow.
And people come in early. They come in like an hour, 2 hours early just to learn how to swing dance.
Huh.
To take lessons so they can look like when Mikey gets the girl,
Right. That's crazy.
Jon Favreau in the movie. And people are dressed up. Girls are wearing these beautiful dresses, high heels. Guys are wearing, zoot suits and English newsboys caps and, looking like it's out of a movie, you know. So we bring him in the studio, and we do one song called Jumpin' Jack. And, we're having fun with the band.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea what we're going to do with them. So we realized where the deficiencies were. Like you asked earlier, what do you do with a new act? Well, they had 4 horns in the band.
Right.
And all they knew how to do was double them. And we listened to that, and it sounded really small.
Yeah.
Even for Jump Swing, you want to do something a bit more interesting. So we employed Tom Peterson, not from Cheap Trick, not the bass player from Cheap Trick, but Tom Peterson, who worked on The Tonight Show for 17 years. Tom wrote these amazing arrangements for these kids. And on the record, we brought in a few more horns with them. And we brought some really fun session guys who worked with the guys in the band.
Right.
And we started recording them. I did it Skunkworks.
Nice.
I did it in off time.
Yeah.
Brad was the client. He paid something, and but I knew this thing was going to go. And so I worked with a guy many years before named Gary Stamler, and Gary was the attorney for a band called Crowded House that I had mixed over at Studio 55. And he and I remained friends, and he was managing me for a while. So I called Gary. Brad was in the office with me, and I said, listen, we got this group. We got to figure out how to option the group because we think we can make a go of this. And we're recording now, and it all seems to be working. Brad was underwriting all this. And that was the beginning of Coolsville Records. And Gary was managing at the time. I mean, he was managing a lot of people, but, during his career, he had worked with everybody from Sammy Hagar, Warren Zevon, Harry Nilsson. He worked with a lot of people. And so I said, Gary, this is not rock and roll, but I said, this could be a lot of fun. All right, let me come and see him. All right, so we went to the Derby, and we all hit it off, and we started this whole thing together. And we just started putting all the sessions together and organizing the time, and we made the record. I never had more fun making a record. The guys had knucklehead humor. Tom was amazing with the guys, as not only as a arranger but as a mentor.
Right.
And Tom spent 17 years on the Tonight Show, so he had all this knucklehead humor.
Right.
That came from Johnny Carson and Doc Severinsen and all that. So we had a ball. We had a ball making the record, and at the end of it all, before everything got released, and we started putting them together with agents and all kinds of stuff, and the band came to me and they said, we want to talk to you and Brad. And I said, what's the problem? Well, we'll talk to you about it. Okay, so what's up? Well, we got a problem with the record. And I said, what's the problem? We think it's too good and we won't be able to live up to it live. I said, that's a quality problem, but I think we can resolve it. And then we worked with Tom, and Tom made live arrangements for the band.
Nice.
And the band was so much fun live.
Yeah.
And then we wound up in 1999 playing Super Bowl.
Wow.
Opening
Nice.
Opening for Stevie Wonder and Gloria Estefan at
Nice.
The Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons.
Right.
At Joe Robbie Stadium in Florida. So in Fort Lauderdale. I was down there for that. It was just unbelievable.
Nice.
I mean, to be on a field with halftime.
Right.
It was a military operation.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So yeah, we did that, and we formed Coolsville Records with Blue Lions and Big Bad Voodoo Daddy. We took the record out of EMI because we couldn't make a deal with the current president. And we moved it over to Tom Wally and Jimmy Iovine at Interscope, and they made a deal with us.
Nice.
Yeah, it was nice. It was.
And is that, I know you're doing a music licensing thing, Coolsville. Is that related? How is that?
Well, what happened was on the way up on all this, we just were grabbing bands and bringing them in the studio.
Right.
One of whom is Johnny Reno and the Lounge Kings. And
Okay.
Johnny was a sax player. He used to play with Stevie Ray Vaughan in Texas. And Johnny was so much fun to work with. And he's like the ultimate lounge singer that plays, we call it the stripper sax sound.
Right.
It's like this real dirty, nasty sax sound that just,
yeah.
and he's so much fun. We did that. We did, we found artists that were doing very, very interesting things. And when they were in town at the Derby, we'd say, well, come by, we'll put you in the studio for a couple hours. I'd book a room and record them. So what we wound up doing, inadvertently, because the neo swing movement really started at Capitol Studios. It was rebirthed with Brian Setzer, Al Schmidt producing Brian Setzer's. I think it was the Dirty Boogie.
Right.
So he started this whole thing. I mean, it all started with Jump Jive and Wail with the Gap ad.
Right.
So once you see that, the music is crossing over into advertising and television.
Right.
You're onto something. It's going to get traction. So we released You and Me and the Bottle Makes Three with Big Bad Voodoo Daddy. We released the record in February of 1998. And it was interesting. At the end of 1997, the record was almost done. And we're doing a showcase presentation at the Hollywood Athletic Club with Big Bad Voodoo Daddy. And we're with the senior executives from EMI and in the distribution arm. And they came to us and they said, we got a problem. We had budgeted to manufacture 50,000 records. They said, we got a problem. I said, oh my God. I said, did we budget too many? Because we didn't expect this whole thing. And they said, no, too little. The advance orders are going crazy.
Oh, geez.
So,
I bought a copy of that. So
cool. Thank you. So we got our gold records. The Big Bad Voodoo Daddy played the Greek, and we got gold records there. And but by May, we released it February of '98, and by May, we had reached 500,000.
Nice.
We sold 500,000 records.
Nice.
So it was like, oh my God, how do we do that?
That's cool.
But these guys are also working 280 dates a year.
Jesus.
8 guys.
That's crazy.
We did South by Southwest with them, with the Blue Hawaiians. And
right.
we took a couple of vans to Austin, and then we went to Dallas to play the Red Jacket Club. And, it was just phenomenal the way these guys would. It was like a military operation. They were just like working their butts off. Everybody clean and sober, no drug issues. Everybody really focused on, it wasn't rock and roll.
Yeah.
But it was, but they all came out of punk.
Really?
Yeah. Big Bad Voodoo Daddy came out of punk. So that's why it translated. It had an edge to it. I used to call it swingabilly. It wasn't exactly, swing, but it rocked.
Yeah.
And it had that kind of edge to it. And the stuff we have on Coolsville now, if you go to coolsvillemusic.com, you'll hear a lot of, you'll hear Big Bad Voodoo Daddy on there because that's part of Coolsville.
Right.
But at the same time, you'll hear Johnny Reno and a bunch of other people that we've worked with. About 100 songs on there. Okay. And we fall into a real unique genre. It's a real boutique kind of compilation. Neo-noir, we call it. And, things that are a treasure trove of material that, a lot of covers that they're obscure, but they're well recorded, well produced, well played. Right. And you can make stems out of them. You can do all kinds of stuff where you couldn't do that with the old stuff.
Yeah, nice. So I just want to wrap up with a couple of questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
Doing it where, every guest gets the same questions at the end just to keep it exciting.
Okay.
What was your most influential teacher? I know it's hard to pin it on one, but, top 3 if you have to.
Irv Greenbaum. Irv Greenbaum was an engineer where I started out with a place called Broadway Recording, which is in the Ed Sullivan Theater building where Stephen Colbert is now on the 9th floor.
Okay.
And Irv Greenbaum was an amazing Latin engineer. He was from the military, and he could copy CW, Morse code. He would do 60 words a minute.
Wow.
He was that quick with it. And but Irv said, nothing that looks easy is. And I learned also, if you want to learn, you'll learn.
Right.
And things like, what are you trying to accomplish? In order for anybody to become a good recording engineer, you have to be able to conceptualize signal path.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to understand what you're doing, the sequence, of components you're trying to put together, the circuit you're trying to create.
Mm-hmm.
It all has syntax.
Right.
So I think Irv Greenbaum, I guess the other 3 guys that I can mention for sure was, Al Schmidt.
Of course.
Al Schmidt was all common sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about where to put the microphone and what your choice in the microphone is. Know your components and preparation. Phil Ramone.
Yeah.
Phil Ramone was a master at dealing with artists. He could be father, confessor, priest, rabbi, whatever you needed him to be. The artist knew that he had their back, that he was there for them. He was their biggest fan, biggest supporter. So as a producer, as an engineer, Phil was also a fabulous engineer. Go listen to 11/17/70, the Elton John, first Elton John record he recorded live for WNEW-FM in New York.
Okay.
He did that for live radio.
Nice.
Beautiful. And then Joe Smith. Joe was a guy who was a pioneer in the music industry in terms of recognizing talent, and as a key executive, being able to make things happen.
Nice.
Nothing was beyond him. So I was very fortunate. I was very fortunate to be. Rupert Perry, another one, still a good friend. Rupert was the kind of guy, always return your phone call, even if you didn't have good news for you.
Right.
He'd do you the courtesy. Bruce Lundvall, same thing.
Nice.
Guy who was president of Columbia Records, and he was president of Blue Note Records when I was there.
Nice.
The Vinyl Viking, we used to call him. Beautiful cat.
Awesome.
What else?
What is your favorite reference track? If you have to go to a new studio and check out the room, or when you're mixing?
I usually I like to bring Crowded House, but, I was in a habit for the longest time of carrying around a lot of different material and not my own.
Right.
I think one of the best mixers ever for rock music is Bob Clearmountain.
Mm-hmm.
Most humble cat on the planet. And I would bring his mixes. It was always that I wanted to be competitive. Mm-hmm. I wanted my mixes to somehow or another be played on the same radio station.
Right. Of course.
So, and I always think that there's always something else to learn.
Right.
Again, it all depends on the genre of music.
Of course.
If I'm mixing a traditional record like, a swing band, or if it's real legit, I want to go and listen to, an Al Schmidt mix,
mm-hmm.
a Tommy Vicari mix.
Right.
I want to make comparisons so that way it's competitive.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Last question.
Mm-hmm.
What would be your one tidbit for an upcoming engineer?
One tidbit. Well, Phil Ramone once again said that as recording engineers, we record history.
Right.
You take a snapshot of a moment in time where you have a performance, and being mindful that you have a responsibility to your artist to give them support, that because you have this gift of knowing the electronics and understanding all that you're only there because of them.
Right.
And without them, there's nothing to record. It's just noise. Yeah,
exactly.
There's nothing to record. So it's a level of humility, knowing that you're part of a team and that you're there for a specific reason to perform, and you got to bring your A game. And I always found that it's being straightforward is the best way. I often think to the young Jeff Emmerich. We were friends for 26 years, and Jeff was a young 19-year-old engineer at Abbey Road who was already mastering and had known all these American records that he was mastering for their distribution in Europe,
right,
in the UK and Europe. And he was just an adventurous young man, totally humble, and wearing a suit and tie to come to work. and showing up. So, show up, bring your A game.
Right. Cool. Awesome. Well, listen, I really appreciate it. Definitely thank you for being here and sharing. And good to have you.
It's been an honor and a privilege.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much for listening to the show. As you know, I'm just getting this started, and I'd love your feedback on how I'm doing, if I should keep this going, what your thoughts are. Feel free to visit proaudioprofiles.com and send me a message. Until next time.